Good evening, everyone. Thank you for being with us this evening and helping us to kick off a week full of events that are election related here at campus. Before we get started, I do have to let you know that in the event of an emergency, please be aware of the exits that are closest to you. There are some located in the front of the room and some in the rear of the room. And at this time, I ask that you please turn off any cell phones or devices. Thank you for being with us tonight. I am Courtney Broscious. I'm an associate professor of political science in the Department of Political Science, Philosophy, and Geography here at Eastern. And I'm honored to be able to serve as tonight's moderator for this event. Current polls are showing a very close race for the presidency, with Kamala Harris leading Donald Trump by under 3 percentage points nationwide, and with extraordinarily close polls in many battleground states. In addition to this election being close, it's also quite controversial, with a lot of citizens and experts issuing some concerns about the health of American democracy. We are very fortunate tonight to have 3 experts who can help us to deepen our understanding of the current election cycle and the implications that it has for our democracy. Tonight's events will begin with questions for our panelists that were written by Eastern faculty. We will reserve 30 minutes at the end of the event for questions from the audience. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our esteemed guests this evening. First, Dr. Erika Franklin Fowler. Dr. Fowler is a professor of government at Wesleyan University, where she directs the Wesleyan Media Project. This project tracks and analyzes political advertising across the country. Dr. Fowler has an impressive background in research related to political communication, including a focus on the content and effects of messaging in campaigns. She's co-authored a book recently on political advertising in the United States. We are also joined by Dr. Stephanie Ternullo. Dr. Ternullo is an assistant professor at Harvard University. Her research examines the relationship between place and political behavior. She recently published a book entitled How the Heartland Went Red: Why Local Forces Matter in an Age of Nationalized Politics. In this book, Dr. Ternullo examines 3 post-industrial cities during the 2020 election and demonstrates how local organizational contexts affect white voters' turn towards the political right. And finally, last but not least, we are joined by Dr. Jonathan Wharton. Dr. Wharton is an associate professor of political science and urban affairs at Southern Connecticut State University. His most recent book, Democracy in New England, focuses on cultural, historical, and political dynamics and political participation in 3 New England cities. Dr. Wharton regularly contributes to discussion in news media as well about policymaking and citizen participation in government. Please join me in thanking and welcoming our guests for the evening. Thank you for being with us. Our first 2 questions are broader questions that anyone on the panel should feel free to answer. So the first question is, how would you describe both Harris and Trump's strategies to attract and turn out voters? And what can we learn from the past in trying to evaluate how successful these strategies will be? So what strategies and how successful might they be?
Eric, I feel like this. Yeah, I'm happy to start. So the strategies. So I am a scholar of political communication, and so I feel the need to differentiate for you. In political advertising, when we think about political advertising, we're usually, at least from a research perspective, thinking about television. I'm sure most of the students in the audience no longer even watch it. So let me first say that television is still a very important way to reach citizens, specifically older voters, but not solely older voters, because there are still audiences for television. And then the digital space are obviously super important for all of you, for younger voters in particular. The strategies that you are seeing, this year is interesting. There's so much that is going on, and I want to, so let me start with the Trump campaign because we have directly comparable data from the Trump campaign for now 3 cycles. This year he and his interest group allies, of which he has many more than he had back in 2016, are advertising heavily on television. And up until this last 3 weeks, he and the Harris campaign were sort of competing neck to neck. He is dropping in volume on television, which is interesting. But I'll contrast that with, in 2016, the Trump campaign sort of blew scholars away, most people away by saying post-election that he had spent half of his campaign budget on digital advertising. That was sort of mind-blowing at the time. No one had spent that much in digital spaces. And it caused a lot of different consternation about reports afterwards about the digital spaces and Russian interference and other sorts of things, and sort of led to more pressure on platforms to put out ad libraries. So if you take that news and then you fast forward to 2024, you might be surprised to learn that the Trump campaign is being outspent on Meta properties, which include Facebook and Instagram, in the early weeks of September by 16-1. And if we look at on Google, which includes YouTube and search advertising, the gap is smaller, but it's still quite large. So different strategies. Trump is putting all of his eggs on television. I think that makes sense for who we know he is as a person. He watches a lot of television, and he obviously thinks it's effective. Whether it's actually effective is a separate question. The Harris campaign, by contrast, is going all out everywhere, right? So you're seeing lots of television, you're seeing lots of digital advertising, and a mix of strategies. I'm happy to talk about the issues, but maybe I'll leave it there for now.
Sure. So I guess I'll just add that there's sort of 2 goals that campaigns could have broadly with their efforts. They could try to turn out, or they could try to persuade. And I think they dictate 2 different logics of where you spend your money, how you spend your money, and what kinds of ads that you would put together. But it also kind of depends on your theory of sort of how people vote and how they choose to vote in an election, choose to vote for, who to vote for in an election. So we know very clearly that in swing states that get a lot of money from campaigns, that money is effective in turning out voters. So a colleague of mine has done work on the 2012 Mitt Romney-Obama campaign, and in swing states, they argue in this paper that the campaigns were each able to turn out like millions of voters, like 2 million voters, I think it was, with 7.8 percentage points more turnout through their campaigning efforts. So if you think that you can accurately target who your likely voters are, then you should go for a turnout. You might go for a turnout strategy, right? And if you think that's really hard to persuade, then you might try to find sort of a really likely Democratic or Republican voter, someone who sometimes votes, but when they vote, they pretty routinely vote blue or red, and then you pour all of your money into get out the vote. You're not trying to persuade them. You're not trying to convince them, Kamala or Trump. You're just trying to say, come out and vote the way we know you would vote anyways. Alternatively, you can try to persuade. So you can take those sort of independent voters, people who are undecided, and you can say, you should vote Harris or Trump. But Erika, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that the most persuasive and recent evidence on this is that it's really hard to persuade voters. It works, but the effects are really small and they don't last very long. So we can persuade people on all sorts of issues and all sorts of candidates if we give them, interesting and effective new information, but it might not fully work to actually shape their vote choice. So if you're a campaign and you have limited resources, of course you want to target those undecided and independent voters by persuading them, but you also want to work really, really hard to turn out your base. And so you'll see a lot more campaign money in places like Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Nevada, Arizona, North Carolina, and they will be absolutely kind of getting their money's worth, I think.
Those swing states matter because it's a matter of the turnout. And we tend to take that for granted. And of course, I don't want to overlook the congressional races. You know, I apologize, ladies, but I'm a legislative hawk. I know everybody likes the presidency and the White House and obsessed about it, but we should also be concerned about who's going to be taking the majorities in both chambers, because we could have essentially a unified government, one way or the other, arguably, between all three levels there. So that's something to add to this when we're thinking about these swing states and the consideration of some of these districts as they're at play, especially for the House of Representatives. I'm thinking more of the House and the Senate, but they're both obviously up for grabs either way for both parties. So that turnout does matter. I also want to add a little bit more context to what you're offering here, especially in Connecticut, which we're unique. Not to be confused with being an independent, unaffiliated voter, because sometimes there's a misconception about this at the local level in a place like Connecticut. If you are registered as an unaffiliated voter, you're an unaffiliated voter. But if you're an independent, we have something called an independent party, which is not the same thing. So make sure you do get some clarity on that in terms of which one you registered for, because that will matter, obviously. Certainly, we have close primaries. That's a consideration for primaries. Even though we're past this stage now, something to think about in the future so that you can participate in the primary in the future. But it will matter what states. We're talking about 6 to 7 states potentially that obviously they're being targeted with these ads that obviously you're bringing up, and that's critical for turnout. But I do want to hit on this point. Many Americans like to think that we're always in this blue-red paradigm, when in fact we lean one or the other. It's these unaffiliated voters that matter in terms of swinging them and getting them to show up to vote. So that unaffiliation factor is important for both parties, for all candidates, not just for the presidency, but definitely for Congress to get them to show up. And remember, even in a state like Connecticut, the majority of voters are unaffiliated voters. We'd love to think that, oh, we're a blue state. Not necessarily. I always argue in my state and local politics classes, the majority of our executive leadership at the local level, first selectmen and mayors, are actually Republicans, and we tend to forget that among 169 municipalities. So keep in mind that it's more a matter of how we lean and how we swing as opposed to being just a blue or red. It's a little bit more nuanced than just that.
Great, thank you. So when we think about the strategies campaigns are using, we have to think about space, we have to think about audience that these candidates are targeting, but also in terms of this election, how do we see race and gender really shaping our election? How are these issues kind of affecting campaign rhetoric, but also voting preferences? Who wants to take a stab at that one first?
I can, if you. Yeah. So I think that when we think about American politics, there's sort of a couple of really important dividing lines. One is partisanship, of course, which party you affiliate with. But others are the dividing lines along race, gender, and also class, and maybe ethno-race, we might say. And so I think one of the sort of most cohesive voting blocs in American politics since the 1960s has been Black Americans who've overwhelmingly affiliated with the Democratic Party and voted with the Democratic Party. And based on polls in this election, Harris might not have as much support amongst this group as Biden did in 2020, but let's set them aside for a moment. And then we have other groups that have a little bit more movement. So Bill Clinton sort of won almost as many white voters in 1992 as Bush. But in this election, Harris will likely lose white voters to Trump by 5, maybe 7 percentage points based on the current polls. That's a massive swing in 20, 30 years. So the movement of white voters out of the Democratic Party and into the Republican Party is a huge transformation. It's largely driven by non-college educated white voters. In contrast, Harris is poised to do really, really well amongst college educated white voters. And this is a group that people as recently as Obama and Hillary in 2012 and 2016 struggled to win. So Harris is going to do really well amongst this group that Democrats have largely struggled with. And then we have Latinx voters who have never been as cohesive as Black voters and have kind of bounced around a little bit. So Harris is struggling with both Black voters and Latinx voters a little bit more than Democrats in recent cycles, doing really well with college educated white voters and basically struggling with non-college educated white voters as much as people like Joe Biden and Hillary Clinton, maybe even more. The Democrats are still losing those folks cycle after cycle. And so I think that those sort of factors shape the constraints of the Democratic coalition. So Obama in 2012 gets the benefits of both the sort of interracial coalition and hasn't lost all of the white working class voters that have now moved to the Republican Party. Ever since then, the Democrats have had to make up for the loss of white working class voters and now working class voters across all races by gaining voters amongst college-educated people and college-educated whites in particular. And so that's a really tricky coalition, I think, for the Democrats to manage, and also will pose challenges for like electoral viability in the long run.
Yeah, so that does a great job at addressing our question about voting preferences. In terms of campaign rhetoric, how do we see gender and race sort of presenting in this campaign?
Well, I've been fascinated by that because what some polls are indicated, something like you touch on, for African Americans, especially for men, is suddenly seeing a bump up for Trump. It was barely 5% in the polls in the previous elections. Now they're talking 10, 15, even 20%. I'm always kind of skeptical, though, about polls because, especially when it's this early out, because, you know, it just doesn't always shake out that way all the time. I think exit polls will be a better indicator on election day. I'm still stuck on the fact that many people tend to forget this. When Trump ran last time, or even back when going against Hillary Clinton, he was able to get over 50% of white women. And that's always kind of interesting to me, like, right? And some of my students are kind of stumped on that, like, how is that even possible? How did that even work out? Well, sometimes people are a little bit more comfortable with whom they think they know and familiarity than anything else. So don't overlook sometimes this gender gap consideration. One thing, too, I think is critical we can't overlook, too, is its age is another demographic. Because we're seeing, obviously, an uptick of more voters registering and participating and engaging, not just in terms of volunteering and donating, but potentially showing up for the polls. And so we even saw this in the midterm race the last time, where it was an increase of almost, 4 or 5% at least, which might not sound much for those under 30, but that was a big number compared to previous elections. If we see a higher increase for those voters who are under 30 approach beyond 50%, which I think is pushing it because it's always been around 40-something% for presidential races, I think we all know that. But it'd be interesting, it could be maybe 5, even 8% for Generation Z, you know, part of that Generation Y. That could be a critical base to go after too, in addition to the gender and even the dimensions surrounding ethnicity and race. I mean, as you said, you know, the Latino factor is one that is very nuanced, and you throw in the gender, you throw in, you know, socioeconomic status, you throw in education. It is not so easy to shake out all the time, because of course they're not a monolith.
Yeah. I would say that on the rhetoric side specifically too, I mean, there are really interesting things that we could say about the gender, you know, rhetoric and the racialized rhetoric. This cycle, obviously, and it's not new to 2024, of course, but abortion is featuring prominently in most pro-democratic messaging for a reason. They see that as a winning issue for their side, and so that is definitely in the ethos. There is interesting gender stereotypes about care communities, and so the Harris campaign is leaning into some of those, so talking about, you know, the child tax credits and taking care of working families and affordable housing and other sorts of things, dropping price of insulin, like these are traditional care issues. So gender is sort of on display in some of those things. But then also, I think women also face this, you know, they tend to be seen as more compassionate and less tough and less masculine, which is typically seen as a good thing for presidential candidates. So she's also on the flip side touting her record as a prosecutor and her toughness, and in part to try to countercut away from the gender stereotypes that we will see. On the racial side, I will say, and it's again not new this cycle, but a lot of leaning in by Republicans specifically to crime-related rhetoric, and immigration is also, over the summer, was a top topic of both campaigns, but it was mostly driven by Republican messaging, not just in the presidential side. We saw it a lot in the 2022 midterms, Republicans leaning into immigration and talking about the problems of immigration and immigrant-related crime, which increases a lot of worry. Democrats are actually talking about those issues too, but usually in a way to play defense.
Thank you very much. So this next question is primarily for Dr. Fowler, but anyone can answer. How would you describe the way the presidential political advertising landscape has changed since 2016? And what role has social media played in that change? You already addressed some of this, but if you could expand on your earlier answer.
Sure, yeah. So I did address some of it. There's been a lot of change, obviously, in the advertising world and paid messaging world, in part because people just are on many more platforms, and campaigns are realizing that in order to reach young voters, they can't just be advertising on local television news and game shows, which used to be some of the, your Wheel of Fortune and your Jeopardy used to be prime viewing spots, and still are for a lot of political advertising for the older audiences in the crowd. But for young voters, they really do need to, seek additional audiences elsewhere. So I already addressed the spending gap between the two campaigns. It's not that Trump doesn't have social media presence, but it's definitely different. In 2016, the platforms also had different strategies with respect to the campaigns. Facebook in 2016 offered both campaigns what they call embeds. So they offered Facebook employees to sit with both campaigns and help them run their advertising. Well, the Trump campaign took Facebook up on that offer. The Clinton campaign sort of said, no thanks, we know what we're doing. I don't know if in hindsight that was a great decision, but I will tell you it was controversial after the fact, right? So Facebook got rid of this policy, it's no longer a thing. What I do think you're seeing the Harris campaign do this cycle, which is interesting, is really play into the different platforms and strategies, and each platform is slightly different. So you can have coherent messaging across platforms, but there are different features of each one, and so they also are paying influencers to be behind the scenes, helping produce additional content for display. So that is definitely different than what we've seen in the past cycle. The Trump campaign is such an interesting case because he spent a lot on Facebook in 2016. Maybe it was in part because Facebook employees were showing him the data and the evidence of effectiveness on the back end, or what they said was effective. But he's not spending really at all on meta properties at all. He's definitely putting a lot of his eggs in YouTube, which is similar to television, and I think there's no surprise that he's doing that because it is more similar. And then I also suspect, but we have less data for it, that he's doing more on his own platform, so Truth Social and other places. We just don't have similar comparative evidence. But that's definitely, there's a lot of interesting different things going on in both campaigns, and a lot of it does have to do with digital. Just more money and more advertising in every place that you can think of. Campaigns are really trying to reach back to the point of the persuasion versus mobilization. Some of it is also information. They're trying to touch citizens who don't necessarily think a lot about politics in any and every way that they can do so, because part of what they also need to do is remind folks, hey, it's election season, start paying attention. You should read up on our policies, you should pay attention and figure out for whom you want to vote.
Are we seeing differences in terms of the content that is being used in advertising that might be on social media versus television media, for instance?
Yeah, so we have done some systematic analysis of that, and maybe contrary to some expectations, including my own, there's been a lot of concern about social media being, maybe micro-targeted, and I think a lot of the concern was, social media may be more negative and more concerning and more whatever. If we look at television versus Facebook specifically, but Facebook includes Instagram, the advertising on the Facebook platform is actually more positive than it is on television, which was surprising to me, even as a political advertising scholar, and I didn't really believe it. I had our students at Wesleyan do additional work. I was like, no, let's try measuring it this way, and let's try measuring it this way, and see if we're actually, is this really true? I've seen enough different models and different measures of negativity now that I actually do believe that the advertising on social media is more positive, but it is also more partisan. So the television advertising messages are negative, but they're intended to persuade. The messages on social media platforms are more partisan, but more positive because they are trying to turn you out to vote. That's a core difference between the two.
Does that include something like Twitter then? I mean, I hate Facebook, I apologize. But I'm curious about even the Elon Musk effect of that in light of that too, right?
Yes, so well, Twitter is an interesting case because they didn't have ads and now they do have ads back, but the data are not as easily accessible, right?
Of course. Yes,
and
yes.
I do think there's a difference. Like when we think about social media platforms too, sometimes we think about what we see in our feed. I'm guilty of this. What I see in my feed must be representative of the paid messaging, but actually paid messaging is its own beast, and often differs from what we see in the organic content. The platforms don't actually make it super easy for researchers to understand the interplay between the two, because campaigns often will pay for a message to be put up, and then they can see how much that message takes off organically. Like if I see an ad, I can retweet it, or I can reshare it, or repost it. And as researchers, we will only see what the campaigns paid for, not what was organically shared. And I think that skews the extent to which we can tell how far a message travels.
Thank you. This one is for Dr. Wharton in particular, but anyone, again, can answer. How important are the policy stances of the candidates to the election outcome, including, for instance, immigration, the economy, and the conflict in the Middle East?
It's critical, and it's important to pay attention to the candidates' records. They're there for a reason, and usually organizations, especially think tanks, which I'm a big fan of, are very good at collecting the data. And so I would say definitely pay attention to what's being said out there in legacy media and certainly social media, but also pay attention to maybe organizations, associations, and monitoring some of the policies, because they keep track of some of this data. And I'm purposely pitching think tanks. Of course, I think think tanks can be helpful because they're collecting some of the data, they do a lot of the policy analysis. Of course, there's going to be some biases there because, of course, they're pitching towards a certain market or membership base and donors, and critical to at least do your homework and recognizing the differences. But if you see at least the specifics as it relates to the policies and the track record for the candidates, that's what you should be paying attention to. And thankfully, a lot of these organizations already keep track of that. So you don't have to do so much homework. You could easily look at some of these organizations or even associations. I mean, I'm a big advocate of being a member of an association organization where they're keeping track of some of this. And outside of think tanks, there's always these professional associations that you can be a member of. ACLU, certainly a PIRG, Policy Institute Research Group. They do a lot of this monitoring where they know where the candidates fall in line. This includes obviously congressional candidates too, not just presidential candidates.
Great, so that helps us with some resources on where to go to learn more about candidates' policy stances, because if you're looking at like the presidential debate, right, you might not have gotten as far as to understanding policy stances. Did you want to add?
Yeah, I was just going to say, in terms of like how important policy stances are for election outcomes, I think there's like a raging debate on this, is the way I'll put it. And I was just teaching this in class to my grad students last week, and so this again goes to sort of like what your theory is of the American voter, and obviously there's many American voters, it's very heterogeneous, but a lot of people think that people vote with their partisanship. So if you're a Democrat, you vote up and down the ballot as a Democrat. Connecticut local races, a lot of split ticket voters there, obviously, so that defies that logic. But other people think that we vote according to policies, but that actually takes a lot of work. I mean, to Jonathan's point, you can go online, you can go to a think tank, you can try to figure out what party stands for what the party platforms are, which candidate has said what, but that's a lot more work than many people can do in any given election, particularly for down ballot races and for midterm elections and off-cycle elections. And so the question of, although if you read the news regularly, you'll see a lot of news organizations sort of questioning where Harris's policies have been, and then somewhere in the middle they'll say something like, but Trump has no policies, so she's a little better than Trump. But the headline is, Harris doesn't have any policies yet. It's still an open question amongst political scientists who study political behavior, the extent to which any of those policies matter. And so if you think about what that means for like democracy, accountability, representation, all of those things, if people aren't voting for policies, if they're just voting for the party and the party is doing a bunch of stuff that they don't know or care about, we're getting representatives and elected officials who are doing a bunch of stuff that we don't know or care about. But again, raging debate on that subject.
I mean, the good thing is that somebody like Vice President Harris is that she was a senator prior.
Yeah.
So you could go back and examine where she kind of landed in some of these areas anyway.
Yeah.
Trump was a clean slate advantage because somebody knew where he stood on the issues. He's neither did he. So now that he's got obviously a record, you can still go backwards and even follow some of that.
No, for sure. And maybe we think the ideal Democratic citizen normatively should do that. But the question of whether they do that suggests the vast majority don't do that.
A student wouldn't do their homework, Professor? I can't imagine such a thing.
I mean, I know all of you will because you've just been told to, but it makes you think about what we're getting when we aggregate up all those votes to an election outcome.
I will say, just to add to the policy conversation, that what's interesting to me about campaign advertising, I'll just take the presidential case for instance, is that it is so policy focused. Normally we think about campaign rhetoric being sort of devoid of policy, and people are, citizens really don't like negativity, but they especially don't like mudslinging, right? But most political ads are actually full of policy. They're chock full of policy. And usually they're going after someone's voting records, right? Because that's the way you draw sharpest contrast. So-and-so voted against doing this, or so-and-so voted for doing this. When we see campaigns deviate from that policy-based messaging, we often do see citizens getting turned off by it. And interestingly, I think that is another clear contrast to the 2016 cycle. The Clinton campaign sort of doubled down on attacking Trump personally because it would seem so outrageous that someone of his character would be elected, and I think the campaign thought that messaging would really work, but it left their campaign without positive, and I don't even mean positive in the positive campaign messaging perspective. It didn't provide a sharp enough contrast between a Trump campaign and what a Clinton campaign would do with respect to policy. And that is very different than most other presidential campaigns we have ever seen. We had a nice graphic that we showed that empirically. And so, because most presidential campaigns, even when they attack, the attacks are actually more full of policy than the positive ads, which I always joke typically have a candidate and their family and a golden retriever walking through the park, right? It tells you a lot about their dog lovers, but it doesn't give you a lot of other basic information. So negativity in elections isn't necessarily bad, but the policy-based conversation I think is interesting in ads. It's not a lot of substance because again, you have 30 seconds to say things, but the extent to which they stick to issues is an interesting contrast.
Americans will say we hate negative ads, but you know one thing? It works. It works. It's problematic. I get it. I'm sick of it myself, especially this time of the year. But you know one thing? The impact is amazing to see the return on it.
I do think, it causes us to pay more attention. One of the things I always tell my students, and it goes back to the original point of, what matters in elections. Negativity matters, but I would say it matters at the margin. That doesn't mean the margin doesn't matter.
Everything matters. Everything that matters in an election matters at the margin, and the margins are the only thing that matter. So I think that's like the one thing to take away when you think about elections.
Right.
That one slice in Pennsylvania for them to show up.
100%.
It could have that impact factor.
If you can turn out 10,000 extra voters in the state of 5 million registered voters, that's huge. It's a very small portion of what's going on amongst the registered voters.
This actually segues really nicely into our next question, which is for you, Dr. Ternullo. Your work on local politics suggests that the conditions in local communities can drive national election outcomes. What do you currently see as we head into Election Day being important factors that we should consider?
Yeah, so I think this goes back to what I was talking about at some point earlier. But this sort of slow drain of white working class voters out of the Democratic Party and into the Republican Party, and then the kind of countervailing force to that. So we can think about those white working class voters as geographically dispersed. They could be anywhere, but they're often concentrated in small towns and cities in key swing states like Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, right? So the loss of those voters from the Democratic coalition has been huge. And it matters particularly, not because they've just lost those people, but because of where those people live, because of things like the Senate and the Electoral College, right? On the other hand, the countervailing force is the sort of growth of the educated, affluent, sort of suburban white woman in the Democratic Party, right? So those are the people who have increasingly, since the 2000s, kind of been flooding into the Democrats' ranks. And so when you think about the constituents there and how that maps onto political geography, we might think about suburbs of Atlanta, suburbs of Charlotte, suburbs of Phoenix, places that used to be like some of the most conservative places in the country. In the 1950s and 60s, these were places that sort of ardently fought against school integration. They fought busing programs. They voted very, very happily for Barry Goldwater in 1964, who ran on a sort of anti-integrationist platform, truly like hotbeds of the conservative movement in the 60s and 70s. And those suburbs could tip those sort of Sunbelt states into the Democratic column this cycle, maybe not this cycle, but maybe the next cycle. Like those are the opportunities of growth for the Democratic Party, and the places where they're going to continue sort of fighting tooth and nail at the margins are in Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, precisely because they have been trying to stem the tide of those communities from their coalition since the 1960s.
Well, I mean, that's the whole point of political alignment, right? Is that we see at least the parties taking that shift. And it's going to be interesting with the generational change too, right? Because obviously, boomers obviously show up, they vote, they have time, they donate, they volunteer. So it's a matter of at what point we're going to see that demographic shift happen for Generation Z. Will it be the same kind of factor to weigh out between both sides? We're also assuming the Generation Z is going to be more liberal, right? Or at least maybe more Democratic leaning. But I think the interesting dynamic in this is that, and scarily and interestingly, younger voters are not affiliated with any political party, right? The numbers are through the roof of those younger voters under 30 who don't want an affiliation by the party. They see that as the evil party or the crazy party. Now, which one's which? You guys can fight that out. But that is a concern for the future in terms of ultimately where they're going to live and where they're going to reside, especially when that sweet spot of like 28 to 32, 34-year-olds, when they start obviously getting homes and having families and having kids.
I think one of the, I'm also very curious about what's going to happen to your generation, basically, as you enter politics in this election and all of the next election cycles. But I think one of the things that we often forget about when we give answers like what I gave earlier about race and gender is that people are not equally distributed across the country, and that what matters, as we've said now several times, for this election cycle, but also control of the Senate, and also for things like local political outcomes. So we were talking about zoning earlier. Like if you want affordable housing in your community, that it matters how people are distributed across space into different communities, right? So that distribution of people into different places is often along lines of race and class. It's historic patterns of racial segregation now mapped onto where people can afford to live, and where the jobs and economic opportunities are. And so the sort of massive shift from an industrial economy to a post-industrial economy, which has made it a lot harder to have a living wage in Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, and really easy to have a great job if you're highly educated in states like Massachusetts, Connecticut, and California. That I think is like the defining change in American political geography and has huge implications for both the Democratic and Republican Party coalitions.
In thinking about those shifts, I wonder how you might think, Dr. Fowler, this might affect political advertising, right? So if we have changing dynamics on the ground and it's all about reaching your audience, how do these shifts approach how we might see political advertising change in the future?
Yeah, it's a good question. Well, I mean, the way that they are already differentiated is the way in which the campaigns approach each state with their own sets of issues, right? So the issues in the Rust Belt are different from the issues in the Sun Belt. And so campaigns will automatically sort of divide and speak to voters where they are in that perspective. I also think, voters or campaigns have to get better at speaking to the coalitions, like where they want to go. And so that is where I think some of the students that I was speaking with earlier were talking about the Tim Walz addition to the ticket and his influence on digital media in particular. And I think it was such a great point because it talks about, like how you talk to voters that you want to reach from different coalitions through ways that might be more appealing to them, right? So you have Tim Walz going to the Michigan game and, like tailgating beforehand, or you have him, doing the car videos where he's both trying to show you how things work and then insert some politics in the instance. I mean, I think that those sorts of strategies and messaging are the ways in which campaigns constantly adapt. They always have, right? So there's a reason why Bill Clinton took his saxophone on the late evening talk shows back in the day, because that's where the audiences were, and he wanted to show people that he was a normal, not just a politician. He cool. Also, right. And there's a reason why, campaigns will consistently look for the latest and greatest. I mean, there over the years have been so many interesting examples of Animal Crossing, the video game. I don't play it, so forgive me for any references, but they did insert yard signs in Animal Crossing. Campaigns are always kind of trying to innovate and figure out where to find you and to find the audiences that might be reachable in some way, shape, or form. It's also a reason why if you're going to fill up a gap, advertising in swing states are everywhere, and you cannot escape them. You go to the gas station and they're on the screen as you're, it's just they're trying to touch you in any way, shape, or form. And so that won't change, but the specific strategies I think that they use to do so probably will.
Great, thank you for those answers. So we have one more prepared question and then we'll move to audience-based questions. But we have a lot of people in our audience who might be facing their ability to vote for the first time in this presidential election. What advice do each of you have for them?
I'll start off then. All right. Everybody's looking at me.
You're all about the young voters.
I know, right? I was about to say. Great. I would say, one thing, as we've been emphasizing, do your homework on all the candidates, presidential, congressional. By the way, it's also, if I can make a shameless plug for state government, it's also General Assembly races too, please. I mean, people forget about Connecticut state government. We do have such a thing. God bless the fundamental orders for people who are historians in the room. Because, we are the constitutional state, obviously, and state government does matter here. And so we can't ignore even the House and even the Senate races here in Connecticut. But do your homework on the candidates, on the incumbents, on certainly the candidates who are trying to go against them too. I would also say this, and I want to add to this. Voting is one thing. Voting to me is like breathing and eating and sleeping. You should already be doing it anyway. Go beyond that. Take it another step up. Consider volunteering. Why not step up and engage yourself and others, your friends, your family members, whomever you know, to also be engaged as well to do the actual volunteering. That's critical. And I'm saying this as somebody who, by the way, not a political scientist, because I got to take my hat off on that, but as somebody who was a former political director for a couple of campaigns at the state races. I do the state races. Sorry, ladies, I don't like the national stuff. I'm allergic to Washington, so especially after working there in that cesspool for 6 years. But the thing is that I would say volunteer. Consider volunteering for whichever candidate, right? Whoever is running. And it doesn't have to be even for the national races. Do the state races. Why not? Do your homework and find a candidate. And the third thing I would critically say is donate. And in the back of your mind, you're thinking, I don't have $1,000. How big are these presidential, $100,000 for some of these, fundraisers? It's ridiculous. Don't worry about that. Even if you're a college student, some of these fundraisers could be $10, $20. And by the way, you'll get fed. They usually are very good fundraisers. I love bundling secretly. I bring a bunch of students to a fundraiser. They have a buffet line, and they're amazed how much food they get for $20. So go for that and get your friends involved in that. My whole adage in local politics is if you can feed them, you can lead them. And so you'll find in some of these races, you'll get fed if you show up and you donate, because that's a big part of it along with voting. Not that I would know running campaigns, but full disclosure.
Sure. So on this local politics train, so you all probably live in Connecticut and you might think my vote doesn't matter, or the state is going to go blue if we're thinking about presidential elections. You might think that as well at the Senate level, and depending on your district at the House level. But your local races are a place where you can kind of get your teeth sunk in. So if you feel like, what's the point? I'll just go, I'll tick the boxes in national races, and you just kind of can't get excited because you live in a state that you feel like doesn't matter. Local races, local government is where, like I said, they make decisions about whether or not you get affordable housing in your community. I saw some new affordable housing going up by UConn a couple of weeks ago. So someone made decisions to make that happen, probably either an appointed planning board member who was appointed by city councilors who Mansfield residents elected to get that housing done. It probably took 8 years, but it got done, and people are gonna move into that housing, and they're gonna have an affordable and safe place to live. And you can, as a resident, decide that you really care about affordable housing and work on the campaign of someone running for city council or town commission, whatever it is in the town you live in, or mayor. And those offices, there is way less money involved. There is way less campaign organization. I briefly co-chaired the campaign for mayor in a small town in Indiana during fieldwork for my first book, just because I was there. Like, there was no one else. It was a high school student and me running this campaign for several weeks. Like, that's how small scale a lot of these campaigns are, and you can really make an impact, and it's a way to get involved. You make an impact on the campaign, and then actually on town policy that will shape lives. It can improve roads, it can improve education, it can improve housing. Huge things that matter for you and your friends and your neighbors and your future kids who will go to the public schools like my cousin does. And so, anyhow, local politics is, I think, more rewarding and also more impactful, and it's a way to, in a state like this, get yourselves more engaged in a more interesting way.
So I will third the local politics route. I study a lot of national politics, but actually local media was, that's where I cut my teeth in my dissertation, and it matters so much. And I want to say, like, your locus of control, so I'll underscore all the other things. Do your research, like, volunteering is so great. If you want to learn anything, go out and volunteer for an organization. They will teach you a ton. Campaigns are great because they're short time frames, and you can gain a lot of experience. The doing your research is way harder the lower down ballot you go, because there's fewer information sources. So the other thing I'd like to underscore that hasn't been mentioned is support your local media. Find ways as college students, you could have a huge impact in terms of providing information about local races, about local candidates, about local policies, about other sorts of things that are happening in your own communities. And you wouldn't believe the difference that can make, because there are a million places for you to go and get information about Donald Trump and Kamala Harris. And by the end of the campaign, you probably are going to be sick of hearing about those two people. But the local races, there are so little information out there that any little bit that you can provide makes a huge, tremendous difference. And so I want to encourage you, your control and your power actually sits in the local community, and it matters a lot. What happens in your local community is much more affected by who you're voting for in those races than higher up on the ballot. So,
especially in a place like Connecticut, where it's a divided media space.
Exactly.
And a lot of media deserts and pockets.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's a good point on the journalism.
Yeah.
Great. So not a lot of advice on the presidential campaign here, but some great advice about how you can make a difference. We know that turnout in local elections is only about 12% on average. And so it really matters, your voice really matters more on the local level. Great. Thank you. So now we have some time where we're going to open questions to the audience. We have a mic back there, so if you have questions for our panelists, you can make your way over to the microphone and by the back exit that I pointed out in the beginning of the evening.
Hello, I'm Jared. Thank you so much for being here. So there's a lot of issues that certain sects of people really care about that aren't so much the voting issues of those that are unaffiliated. I care a lot about climate change, but that's been pretty quiet this cycle. How much can you tell about what a candidate's policies are going to be whenever they're so quiet, stuff in that general area? Because I think I have a lot of confusion about that area, about trying to figure out how to feel about that and them being so quiet on it.
Yeah, it's a great point, and climate is one of the biggest concerns of voters that is not being talked about in campaign ads and hasn't been. It also wasn't a big issue in 2022. It wasn't a big issue in 2020, and that's because obviously campaigns were dominated by COVID and the economy. But even before that, it was healthcare, right? So that it does seem like climate always gets overlooked by something else that seems more urgent at the time. I would encourage you to go to the candidates' websites to see what kind of information is there. Back to the voting records, I think that can be really helpful and important. And I would follow organizations on climate that you trust, because often they will rate candidates, even who haven't been in office yet, because they've interviewed them and talked to them extensively about what's your policy on this or that. And so those are often, there will be like rating reports depending on the, obviously more of these are available up ticket than they are down ticket. But take advantage of those resources, because they will provide you more in-depth information than you might get from things like campaign advertising.
No, I mean, I totally agree. I think that a lot of organizations, like Jonathan was saying earlier, they put together sample ballots, actually, and often all the way for your state. If it's an organization that has like a statewide movement, like a lot of the gun control groups have this. I don't know, like the Sunrise Movement, I know is a big climate group. I don't know if they have statewide ballots, but they'll basically tell you who their endorsed candidate is at every level. And that requires you to first trust an organization, and so maybe you're also having trouble with that first. But I think, just to echo all of Jonathan's excellent points from earlier, you have two candidates with records on this, right? You had a Republican presidency under Donald Trump for 4 years that took action vis-a-vis climate and the environment, and you had 4 years of a Biden administration, of which Kamala Harris was a part. And so you can look, if you Google the terms like Biden administration climate policy, there is a website for it. And if you Google the terms climate policy Trump administration, I'm not sure if there's a website for it, but there probably is. But it's like, it's there. And so you can kind of see like what you want on climate action, what have they already done in the past, and is that what you're gonna get from them in the future. And I think this is another case where partisanship and parties as organizations are probably relevant. If you have a sense that the Democratic Party and the Republican parties generally have different stances on issues, like that's a good heuristic. That's why a lot of people vote that way. Not to go away from like do the homework, but maybe you're here, so you probably want to do you're asking how to do your homework, but in case other people don't want to do their homework or they get overwhelmed by their homework. If you know in the past that Democrats normally do this kind of thing and Republicans normally do this kind of thing, obviously like we have some party-defying candidates out there in this cycle, but it's a good shortcut. It's a good shortcut to think like, I like what Republicans do on climate or abortion, I like what Democrats do on climate and abortion, whatever. That's a pretty safe bet.
Well, thank you, ladies, for the shout out. Yeah. Appreciate it. I would say to add to what she's offering there is that I am a card-carrying member of the National Association of Railroad Passengers. You probably never even heard of it, but they are transit advocates. I like my trains. And God bless our little Shoreline East train. I'm always advocating for that little train. And I bring my bicycle on it every once in a while. And so I purposely sign up for something like that because I'm all about doing something for the environment in that sense, to take trains and advocate for more public transit uses on purpose. Of course, it's also my research. So it's a shameless plug for it. But guess what? I get the newsletter every month. I get the updates all the time, and I get to know where the candidates stand on public transit. They do all my homework, and I don't have to worry about it. It's like I'm cheating, but I'm not. They're doing all the research, and they're doing all the data, and that helps me out, and it comes on a regular basis. Let me also say something that I don't want to be all positive. I've got to throw it a little negative. I gave a discussion last week online for an association in Fairfield County, and it kind of hurt me to read all these bills that came through the General Assembly related to climate change in Connecticut. And do you know what happened? None of them passed. And when I spoke and caught up with a couple lawmakers, because God knows I bump into enough of them, I said, what the heck happened with these bills? We had no support or no interest from constituents. In Hartford, they really do pay attention to constituents. So whatever you do, it can't just be you, get others to rally, show up to the hearings, show up to the meetings, show up to the workshops, write letters, advocate. Trust me, stateside, they had all these bills, and it died. Why? Constituents don't respond back. So I'm telling you right now, when you know there are bills up there going to the General Assembly, do your due diligence, absolutely, but show up. Write and advocate. If it's that much of a concern, do it. Trust me, I am very mean with my pen when I write for the Connecticut Hearst Media, when I talk about public transit. And I go bonkers when they're shortchanging something like my train lines. And I do that on purpose as a columnist, on purpose, and I have fun with it. And the lawmakers are ticked off with me when it happens. And it's usually the Democrats, which is kind of interesting to me. So yeah, do whatever you can to make it, something hit home that way. If you're that resident, and you are, then get it out there and get others to be involved and be just as motivated too.
Thank you so much.
Hi, my name is Emma. Currently, a big ticket issue with younger voters is United States involvement in foreign wars, particularly with Russian aggression towards Ukraine and Israeli aggression towards Palestine. How do you feel that the candidates, both Harris and Trump, can appeal to this younger crowd of voters that are very concerned about these issues, and that really can dictate how they'll vote in this election? How do you think these politicians can get their points across with how they'll deal with these issues?
This feels like an Erika question.
Wow. I'll go for it.
Go.
I mean, because it is an issue. It is a critical one, obviously, and especially now that we're dealing with Lebanon on top of everything else, right?
Yes, especially Lebanon
Especially
now.
now, because I mean, my class, they're obsessed about this, right? Foreign policy making is a very difficult area. There's no doubt about that. And I'm the last one to be talking about it because that's not my expertise. Although secretly, I do have a degree in diplomatic history, so I could at least offer a little of insight on that. The candidates and where and how they stand on this will matter in the sense of what are they offering, what are they suggesting to get out of dealing with negotiating any kind of peace agreement to begin with in Gaza, let alone in what's going on in Lebanon. And of course, we have to pay attention to see what they offer. But going back to your points, we want to see concrete examples of what could be said. Agreements, treaties, ceasefires, all of these things. And that should be expected out of our candidates, not just for the presidencies, but also for Congress. Because remember, key to this will be the Senate and see what can be negotiated out for agreements. So I would add beyond just the presidential candidates, see what we can see with the senatorial candidates to see what they can do about, obviously, what's taking place in the Middle East, but certainly with Ukraine, because that's going to be critical. One other aspect I had to say is, and I know you all will probably touch on this, who are their donors? Because that's key too. That support matters, especially when it's coming to issues related to certainly Ukraine, but absolutely what's taking place in the Middle East, because we know a lot of donors, a lot of that money is going somewhere. And I'm just saying somebody who's a good government guy, because that's going to be critical to know what direction, where they're leaning on because of their benefactors. So I'll add that to context to everything else beyond the policy making, but it's also the donors too.
Yeah, I think is your question more about how the campaign should talk to you, or?
I realize I phrased it poorly, sorry. I was asking on behalf of somebody else. I think what I'm more interested in is how these campaigns can push their agenda in a way that is palatable to young voters, because with what currently the United States is heavily funding Israel and giving them arms and funding their force to attack Palestine and now Lebanon. So what I'm curious is how can this current policy maybe shift to key in the younger voters who are against this aggression in the Middle East and in Eastern Europe as well?
Yeah, so thanks for the rephrase. I don't see a lot of evidence that the Trump campaign is interested in doing that. I mean, he said pretty clearly in no uncertain terms that he is Israel's best ally. I think the Democratic Party is in a tough spot here. And I guess I'd like to differentiate between your general election season and then any other time. So young voters can and should push their parties, no matter which one they may be, to go beyond where they currently are. In general election season, because parties have to fight for those fractions of a percentage, you're never going to see either party go all the way one or the other, because they can't. They literally can't. And so if you are a supporter of the Democrats, maybe you are, maybe you aren't, but if that's the party, you're never going to see them come out fully in support of either side there, because they have coalitions that are very heavily invested on one side or the other, and often both, but they have constituents on both sides that they need to cater to win a general election. But that doesn't mean that the young voter, actions and pushing of a party doesn't matter. I think actually you saw the Democratic Party move a lot. It may not feel like a lot from, but I would say from a longer term observer of campaigns, you actually did, like the fact that Kamala Harris during her nomination speech actually spoke about Palestine is a big sign that they are taking younger voters' positions on this issue seriously. And so I think those are the things that I would look for in campaigns, but recognize this time and space and when parties can do more and when they're really more constrained.
I think, primary season is the time to do that pushing. And I think, we saw all the discussion in Michigan in particular during the primary about what was going to happen in the Detroit area with Muslim voters in response to Biden's funding of Israel. And so people were really focused on that and wondering what he was going to say in and around that particular time. But that's also because primaries are much lower turnout and dominated by much more informed and kind of activist type voters. And so the common wisdom is your primary electorate is just very different from your general electorate. And if you want to win in a primary, you are more attuned. Like if you're in a competitive Democratic primary, as a lot of Democrats are in Connecticut, for you, that would be the place, because they have to be attuned to their loudest and most activated voices during their primary, because that's their toughest race. They hit the general as a Democrat and they're going to win because of all the stuff I said before. So
unless local races.
Right. Yes. But for the most part, federal candidates, Democrats, are going to win in Connecticut. So your opportunity as a voter in Connecticut is during contested primaries for Senate and House races to push those candidates to listen to your voice. And in the general, they just can't. And so you at that point, unfortunately, in a two-party system, have to kind of take the party that you think has like the balance of issues that best represent your voice and your concerns, and then get back at it in the primary. And I'm just assuming the folks in this room are the kinds of people who would be willing to be that active voice. And having had dinner with you, I think you are one of those. And so that would be your time, right? Find a contested Democratic primary and in the next cycle, and find the candidate running in that primary who could be pushed to represent your voice on that issue.
Perfect, thank you so much.
Hello, I just want to say thank you for being here. My name is Aiden, and my question kind of speaks towards low propensity voters. I think constantly this cycle we've been talking about double haters before Kamala Harris came into the race, and more towards people who haven't made their mind up when we're, 34, 35 days out? Who's counting? So I know you don't have a crystal ball, but my question to you is, who are these people on the sidelines a month out from an election without their mind made up? I feel like for a lot of people, at least for myself, it feels like a very obvious choice. I'm a very opinionated person regardless. So I find that a little difficult to not immediately want to make a choice. So maybe that's my question to you, is maybe what's the type of person, or what can our impact be? What is our job?
So I have two thoughts on this, because I say this a lot to my media politics students. And I don't want to make presumptions about all of you in this room, but I would venture that because you're in this room, you are not representative of the average American, because most Americans don't pay any attention to politics, would prefer not to pay attention to politics, and are not anywhere near as tuned in as you are. So that can be hard to understand when you're so passionate and you have so many things that you think matter, which they do matter, but I think the average American citizen is busy, and they have lives, and they have commitments, and they have and also if you're a little bit conflict avoidant, politics can feel and sound like it's awful and terrible, and so you might just want to shut it out of your life entirely. You want to avoid it, right? So that's part of what's going on. And I think there is a lot of evidence. There's great new books out about how there is a large amount of the American public who is not of either partisan activist. They're this bubble in the middle that really hates the arguments that are going on both sides. And so that's part of what's going on. But I also suspect, based on what you said, that you are what we would call in social psychology an online processor. Like, you hear something and you want to have an immediate opinion about it, right?
Perhaps.
Perhaps. So imagine, if you will, some other, and you probably have encountered people like this in your life who will come across information, but they want to figure out how they feel about it, but it's going to take them a lot more time. So they're going to just keep accumulating evidence and wait until they have to make a choice. Like, they're forced to make a choice to decide, what to do with all that information that they encountered. And so that's just a different type of cognitive processing. So I think those two things hopefully sort of explain to you.
No, completely.
But, yeah.
Can I just ask a really quick follow-up to that? Is there historical precedent, or is this a 2024 decision, putting it off to the last second?
Oh, I don't think all voters do that. I'm just suggesting that there's a lot of heterogeneity, right?
Right.
And it's always been the case, I think, that you have strong partisan bases. Those are the ones that the campaigns are trying to mobilize to bring to turnout. But then there always is going to be this sort of center coalition that, if it's a competitive contest, both parties are fighting for. And sometimes, that the rise of early voting makes this more interesting in some ways, because in older campaign cycles, October was always, you talk about the October surprise. What is it going to be? Because in some cases, you would have an event pop up that really shaped, and that's what changed the undecideds' minds, and they broke all for one candidate versus the other. So it's not a new phenomenon.
No. I met this voter the other day. So firstly, in historical perspective, our one of the very first sets of studies ever on the American mass public was conducted out of Columbia in 1940. FDR was running, and Wendell Willkie. Anyhow, and the conclusion of that, it was a campaign, a longitudinal study. They interviewed the same voters, I think, 4 times over the course of 6 months of the campaign, and the conclusion was that most people don't change their minds. Some people do. They turn the election because the margins matter, and it's largely independents and cross-pressured voters, and I think that kind of holds true in most elections. And cross-pressured voters are people who, both parties want them, and their kind of issue positions, or who they are as people, basically it's people who are on the fence. It's kind of logical. People who are on the fence in general. But I met this woman the other day. I do a lot of in-depth interviews with people for my research, and I was interviewing someone, lifelong Democrat, deeply concerned about abortion, who then said, lives in California, you would think, urban, you would think Kamala Harris all the way. And then she was like, but this cycle, I kind of really get where the Trump support is coming from, because cost of living is insane. I'm worried about rent all the time. If I can't get Obamacare, I can barely afford my health care. And I don't know what to do. And he's the only one talking about that. And he's been talking about it. And he's suggesting that maybe we need to do some deporting of immigrants to help with that. And I'm kind of on board with that. That's what this woman said to me. And I was like, you're a poll. She is the polling average. Really concerned about the economy, immigration, and then abortion. And super confused across those 3 issues. She is the polling average. And it kind of concretized for me exactly what I've been reading about in the polling averages, and sort of knew intellectually, but I just heard this woman kind of reason it out loud, and all of those things made sense in her mind, and she considers herself completely undecided and probably won't vote in this election, if that helps.
Yeah. Thank you for your time. Oh, okay.
Hello, thanks again for being here. I'm Kiera. And my question was, what are your thoughts on media that's not necessarily created or sponsored by the candidates especially when there's such a large amount of young voters that are interacting in these media spheres, that are interacting with these kind of like memes or edits of these individuals. What are your thoughts on like how that might affect the election?
You're the expert.
So you mean the organic content,
Yeah.
right? And can I follow up? Are you specific? Like, do you want me to talk about organic content online specifically, like that space, or
Yeah.
other? Okay. So I think it matters, right? It's, I study political communication, so I'm not going to tell you that messaging doesn't matter, that memes don't matter, right? They all matter at the margin. That's the first thing I have to say. Our campaigns are always driven by the fundamentals, which is the economy, the distribution of partisanship, and whether we're at war, big events, things like that. But the messaging and the narratives certainly matter, and I think especially for young voters who aren't necessarily clued into politics, a lot of the ways in which they'll be hearing about campaigns, and it matters more the lower down the ticket you go, that they'll be hearing about them from their friends and from their social media feeds. And that matters. You know, my oldest is 15, and he gets up too early to stay up late at night, so he didn't watch the presidential debate. But you know what he saw the next morning? He was like, I heard that Trump was saying that he won everything. Is that true, right? And I was like, who are we following online? I was so curious. I wanted to understand like where that had come, but it was all being, tweeted in his feed, not tweeted. Reposted in his feed. I'm not actually sure I got to the platform side of things, but I'm always super curious about how and where the information comes from. But it's often you follow someone who has a political interest, and then your feed is being populated with their things. That's not advertising. That's your social network in the real sense, right? But that matters because evidence suggests that citizens do pay more attention to people that they know and people who they know in real life too. Like, you can learn to know somebody in an online space, but especially as you're like sharing information with friends and family, that can matter as well. So I think the memes, and I don't know which way you were hoping I would go with this question, but I think the sharing of information is important. The one thing I would say, because there is so much misinformation and so much out there that can be especially concerning, and actually your generation does this better than any of the rest of ours, take a beat before you choose to repost something, and just consider whether, have you read it all? Is it make sense? Is it consistent with the other things that you're seeing out there, so that you don't contribute to the problem of misinformation? That's not your question, but I wanted to say that because I haven't said that yet.
Thank you.
Hello, my name's Rebecca, and I just had a quick question. It was kind of touched on briefly earlier, but do you think that the increasing distaste in politics and partisanship comes from media or other factors?
I'd love to blame the media personally, but it's more complex than that, right? I mean, I'm a big proponent of political socialization, right? And I assume, ladies, we know a little bit about political socialization. I'm a big proponent of that. It's sometimes it's a matter of your family, your friends, your mentors, people that you interact with, and kind of shaping your viewpoint and perspectives is the idea of political socialization. It's quite an interesting phenomenon, especially early on. So as much as we love to point everything at the media or at the political parties, I'm a big proponent of thinking it's more within the family or back at home and your neighborhood and your community space. And so I think that could be an important factor. Every time I teach US government, the first week of class, I always have my students reply and ask, what sort of media do you pay attention to? And it's kind of interesting how it comes back to the family. Well, my parents listen to this radio station or that TV station or whatever, and at the end of the day, they don't want to because they're turned off by MSNBC because they hear it all day, right? So that's interesting that we've got the media factor in there along with the family and how much of an impact that can be for it, right? So I think a part of it can be the media, but more of the thing is the family unit. It's your friends, it's if you're congregate with. I mean, I don't want to forget the Robert Putnam phenomenon, obviously, especially your way towards Harvard University there. Professor Putnam saying this, it's our social capital spaces and places where we connect with and who we network with that can kind of lead us in the direction where we go politically. And so I think that can be an important factor too. But I really think a lot of it is going back to, where you were raised, how you were raised, and who your family unit is. And so I tend to think more of that than anything else. One thing that I think that stands out a little bit more with Generation Z that I'm struggling with, I'm still trying to grapple with this, is that there's a healthy distrust of institutions. Political, partisan, military, government, religious, financial, universities, you want to keep on going? And so that's kind of interesting to me of why there's this disinterest in suddenly just saying, you know what, I don't want to be part of any of it, I'm tuning out, I'm going to find another pathway instead, or not even being engaged at all. But again, I wonder how much that's related to the family familial unit or friendship connections for this reason.
If I could just add one thing to this idea of political socialization. So a lot of that has to do with where and how you grew up, not just your family, but the community in which you lived. And we know as a general rule that the lowest turnout voters tend to be lower income and lower educated. That there's an idea that it's like you have to have resources to vote. Although everyone should do it, like eating, breathing, and drinking, a lot of people can't, right? Like they're busy, they have 2 to 3 jobs, they don't have time as a resource. And add on top of that in a lot of communities that have been sort of faced massive disinvestment, both from the private sector and the public sector in the last several decades, they've, at the individual level, lost income. They don't have job opportunities. The jobs they do have aren't good union jobs anymore. They're precarious work. They're piecing together, you all are college students, you're piecing together 5 jobs plus class plus like all these clubs you're involved in this room that I learned about tonight. And so you know what that hustle is like. And then you have to add voting on top of that with 3 kids. And you have watched your community decline, you've watched your friends and relatives' abilities to engage in these kinds of organizations that you're talking about decline. And the idea that any of these institutions, including government, are going to help you or serve you or that they're for you, that idea feels far-fetched, that either of the political parties is for you. You don't need the media for that. You just need lived experience in a lot of communities in this country. It does not feel like government is for you.
Thank you.
Hi, Matthew, University of Connecticut. We talked a lot today about this transforming political atmosphere, but one thing that we didn't really see either campaign necessarily touch on is this emerging and very real threat of this new Cold War we're experiencing right now, specifically with China, not just in a weapons race, but also a technology race. So my question is, what role do you see technology playing specifically in this election, but also future elections regarding AI and outside influence of other countries?
Whew. I think it'll continue to play a role, right? There's no world in which technology exists and it's not used. I would say that I don't know how exactly I want to phrase this. AI is concerning in some ways. I'm not sure it's the end-all be-all of the thing we should be concerned about now, but with respect to, it's everywhere, right? But it's not, I don't think we're seeing a ton of evidence that AI specifically is affecting at least the campaign discourse. Can AI influence citizens? Yes, there's already academic papers about it, right? Like individuals, even if they know they're interacting with an AI chatbot, can be convinced of things. So that's concerning. I do think on the foreign dimension, there's a lot there, right? And there's a lot at stake in this election cycle about how and where we go as a nation with respect to international affairs. So certainly really important. I don't know if there's...
Yeah, no, beyond even Russia's influence, certainly China is a big factor in this. Critically, especially in how we stand and deal with Taiwan, among obviously other places. And as somebody who studied abroad in Asia, and particularly in Hong Kong, I've been obsessed about that with the Hong Kong factor, because we've been a big ally and supporter in light of Taiwan and even Hong Kong, but now in light of what's going on, there's obviously that element of uncertainty. We don't know exactly what China could be capable of on the campaign. And by the way, donor side. I hate getting back to the money,
Yeah,
But the donors are pretty big in a lot of these races coming from Chinese influences, and even corporations and businesses too, and even the government.
and I think it used to, back in the Cold War, speaking from the media perspective, there was more bipartisan agreement about what we didn't want. And that matters for discourse, right? Because the media, and I agree with you that they are often the problem, we are the ultimate problem because of what we pay attention to, and media are a business, so they have to, they're constrained there, unless we're willing to subsidize and provide more money to media, but that has its own issues. But in any case, what I think the danger right now of outside interference in elections is a real one, because they've realized that democracies are more vulnerable to internal division from external forces, and that is a real problem. If they divide us against each other, then they can have more influence, and that will always be a risk, I think. But it's even more of a risk when we're outside of a universe where parties, partisan elites on both sides agree what the stance should be.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is John Pirro. I'm a graduate student at Central Connecticut State University, and I actually am a university employee. Woohoo. So, I've been trying to figure out how to word this question, because it's a very troubling one. So, I'll start off with a little background to it. So earlier this year, I saw a film by A24 called Civil War. And it depicted a very near future dystopic United States of America, not really so united. And really, I dove deep into it, found an interview with the director, and pretty much he talked about how this depicts a world where we just stop listening to each other altogether. More and more, I'm seeing just evidence after evidence of just us slowly turning and becoming that. And that scares me greatly. As somebody who's studying student affairs, student development, I am tasked with eventually developing, well, hopefully, a good generation of people, right? I'm part of that movement. And I'm terrified. How do we find a way forward to just listen to each other?
Oh, I love that question. Because you know one thing secretly, actually admittedly, I'm a political romantic. I'm the complete antithesis. I see a lot of faith in interest coming from the university environment. There's something to be said that can be positive when you engage in a space, in a place where you can actually turn this around. And I'm fortunate that at least I'm the advisor for both the college Democrats and college Republicans. Now you might think, well, how the heck do they even get along? They have shared meetings. They actually have debates on campus at Southern. I had 80 students show up at the School of Business on a freaking Monday night at 8 o'clock at night. And I was shocked at how they were so civil to each other. And it was a panel of 10 from each organization, of audience members who were engaged in actually asking thoughtful questions. And so I will tell you this, you are at the university here. Find a way of creating a similar environment of space, and secretly see how other universities do it. Shop around. You'd be surprised. Some universities do such a thing, and you could be the first one to carry out something here in terms of dealing with that. But I agree, that movie was disconcerting. I get it, and I've seen it. But you know one thing? Find a space and a place where you can do it, and thankfully you're in a place where you can do it. And I'm grateful that I'm able to lead that kind of environment. And by the way, it's not like everybody's going to sing Kumbaya and everybody's going to be happy. Trust me. Politics is nasty, is brutish, is short. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm quoting a certain Leviathan writer. But, it can also be a happy space. And as somebody who loves Rousseau as opposed to Hobbes, I'm sorry, I'm a Pisces. I wear rose-colored glasses every once in a while. Find it. Trust me, it's doable. I'm not saying it's easy. I'm not saying it's pleasant. But you can at least shape it and at least kind of force at least some kind of, I like the Greek word ethos. Belief, a culture, a system yourself. Even if it's at the micro level, why not? You're able to do it, do it.
Well, I think you don't need rose-colored glasses in this instance, because I think that this isn't actually that far from reality, right? We've talked already about people who are sort of like in partisan teams and then the independents, but within those partisan camps, we have some people in this country who are very, very polarized, and the media probably plays a role in this because they're self-selecting into media environments, whether it's online or on TV, that tell them sort of exactly what they want to hear and reinforce their biases. And they're in silos, and they in some ways are living in completely different realities from other people, right? And those people we might be really concerned about because they might do things like try to prevent the certification of an election like we saw in January 6, 2021. So we might have reason to be really, really worried about those people, but that is not the average, that is not the median, that's not even the 75th percentile of extremity in this country. That is not how, so it is true that political discussions feel fraught. It is true, if you're interested in this, Taylor Carlson at WashU has a fantastic new book and several great new papers about how it actually like raises people's anxiety to engage in political like disagreement with people. They don't.
I'm sorry, can you?
Taylor Carlson.
Taylor Carlson.
Yeah,
okay.
She's a political scientist. But it's very uncomfortable for us to be involved in disagreement. But a lot of times we aren't necessarily. Do you think that's a bad thing necessarily? It means that we're not talking about politics at Thanksgiving. It means that I can sit down with some of my family members who maybe don't agree with my politics and have a lovely meal knowing they're across the aisle from me and knowing I have deep affection and love for people who are across the aisle from me. So you're building solidarity without having political disagreement. What would it do us to shout at each other over the table? So yes, we're probably not talking to each other all that much, although I'm working on a new project on this right now, so give me 4 election cycles and I'll get back to you.
Really?
But
I look forward to it.
But we're probably not, but at the same time, we're not as extreme as like those sort of dystopian images, and the most extreme among us would lead us to fear. And so I don't think, you don't need rose-colored glasses. Like, it's just not all that bad. If you want to worry about something, I would worry about our institutions, and I know nothing about that. So I can't assuage your concerns there. I do not know like how vulnerable our institutions are to democratic erosion and backsliding. There's a lot of debate about that too, and I don't come down on any side of it. So worry about that, but not about the people. They're fine.
Okay.
We're reaching the end of our time for the evening. We've had one person waiting for a while, so let's have this as our last question of the evening.
Hi, my name's Dylan. I'm a junior at Eastern. I was wondering how big of a factor you think the vice presidential debate will have on this election, considering the fact that there was only one debate between Kamala Harris and Donald Trump.
So as a good political scientist, I am required to tell you debates don't matter. Because they don't to the election outcome. But the way that I do think they matter is in the media discourse that follows. And it's a little ironic for me to even repeat the classic discipline line of debates don't matter, because there was a debate this cycle that clearly mattered, right?
In the middle of summer, no less.
Yes, exactly. So I think it'll be interesting, and I think it'll be important. I don't think either of the candidates are well known. They are not, they at least nationally, you have the people of Ohio and the people of Minnesota know these candidates still much more than the rest of the country. So the rest of the country will get, more time to learn about these candidates. Neither one of them are, the vice presidential ticket, and back to the, what can vice presidents do? I mean, we need more civics, generally. I think that a lot of the discourse, and you heard some of it in the previous debate about Kamala Harris should just go back and find a bill and sign it, Anyone with a basic civics education in the United States would know that the vice president, cannot do that, and there's no, the vice president does very few things besides tie-breaking votes. Obviously, is head of policy and other things, but vice presidential candidates don't matter that much. but they do really matter for the media narrative. And so I think how the candidates do and how they present each other will provide fodder for the news media to cover for a little while. Will they be the end-all be-all of everything? No. And I think that, marginal, again, everything comes back to the margins. Please feel free to disagree with anything I just said.
No. Actually, I do want to disagree.
Please,
yeah, I do.
Go for it.
I do. I think it's interesting in polling over and over again that a number of Americans don't know who the candidates are, both VP candidates. Quite interesting. It's taken a while for the average American to know who are these two Midwesterners, right? Despite even Vance, who's got his book and obviously the movie out and Netflix, whatever. But it's still interesting or even concerning that for both these, lawmakers at least, they're just not a known brand. So I think that they have to get themselves out there for this debate. For those people who are not familiar with either candidate. I mean, yes, I agree with you in the sense that vice presidential candidates don't have that impact factor. But to make a rounder ticket, especially for candidates we don't know, I think that would be the impact as it relates to the debate. Get themselves out there in terms of personality, not just the politics, but who are they?
I think that matters for them, for sure, as candidates and for their political future. And I think for for voters who are considering Donald Trump specifically, they should care about who J.D. Vance is because of the age of Donald Trump generally. I mean, I think that does matter. I just would quibble with the extent to which it matters to the ultimate choice that voters make in the ballot box. But I do think, there are lots of ways in which it still will matter. I encourage you to watch. I encourage you to, tell your friends to watch.
I love it.
Thank you.
All right, well, I want to thank everyone for being here and thank you for your questions, and especially thank you to our panelists who gave us a lot of information for us to think about how we can engage in politics in a positive way moving forward. So please join me in thanking our panelists. Thank you.
Thanks so much for having us, Courtney.
Yeah, thanks for being